Greetings and welcome. I hope this finds you healthy. I hope you are well, and I hope that you are in reasonably good spirits given the circumstances. I look forward to giving this talk, although I must say that at this stage in our class, at this point in our curriculum, I am desperately afraid that you are as sick and tired of my voice as I am. Uh, but I hope that doesn't get in the way of you finding interest in this lecture. A talk that's going to walk us through the single term presidency of George H.W. Bush. That is the first Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president of the United States, not to be confused with the 43rd president of the United States, his son, George W. Bush. All right. In order to attack this content, we are going to give a little bit of background on George H.W. Bush, and then we'll look at the '88 election, interesting in its own regard. We'll take a snapshot into the foreign policies of Bush 41 and a longer, deeper dive into his foreign policies. I'll share with you a couple of Time magazine covers. Time magazine was very much the rag of record for the second half of the 20th century in the United States. And in this 1991 Time magazine cover, where they have Man of the Year, or now Person of the Year, they gave to George H.W. Bush the Men of the Year cover. Quote, George Bush seemed like two presidents last year. One displayed a commanding vision of the new world order, that being in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union. The other showed little vision for his own country. And that is very much the legacy of George H.W. Bush. He was surely more interested in foreign policy than domestic policy, not unlike Eisenhower and other presidents who preceded him. But this is not exactly high praise for his interest in foreign policy as much as it is criticism of his, according to Time magazine, sort of woeful neglect of domestic policy. And so we have on the left this sort of visionary of Bush 41, looking into the future with bright eyes. And then we have sort of this somber blank face as he looks at more domestic issues. Okay. Yeah, I'm tempted to seek to evaluate the degree to which this criticism of Bush 41 is valid, but perhaps the talk I give will give you the opportunity to sort of make that decision for yourself. Perhaps future studies of Bush 41 will help you to decide whether this was an appropriate criticism of Bush 41 as he moved into the 1992 election cycle. Spoiler alert, he lost. He was a single-term president. And, I guess maybe it's worth thinking about why it is that he became a single-term president. So maybe have that at the back of your mind as I go through his domestic and foreign policies. Okay. First, a little bit of background. His father, Prescott Bush Sr., was a Wall Street executive, very successful, later became a senator from the fine state of Connecticut. The Bush family is, how should I put it? Very blue-bloodish, very distinguished, austere, something of royalty in 20th century American history. For that reason, young Bush, shrub, they called him, went to Phillips Academy of Andover, one of the most prestigious boys' schools in the United States. He was distinguished in his service during World War II, and then later went to study economics at Yale University, where he matriculated with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. He was also, like his father and son, surely his son, actually I'm not sure about his father, a member of Skull and Bones, which is this famous in some circles, notorious in others, fraternity in New Haven. After graduating with his degree in economics, he went out to become, with the economic support of his father, a very successful oil man in Texas, where he began to sort of take on some of that Texas swagger and Texas attitude. He became sort of an adopted Texan, so much so that he represented the 7th District in Texas for 2 terms in Congress, made a name for himself in Congress, uh, and for that reason, Richard Nixon made him an ambassador to the United Nations, after which he was the director of the CIA. He was vice president under Ronald Reagan for 8 years. So what we're talking about here is a highly decorated, right? Highly decorated in the military, in academic circles, in business, in politics, a very distinguished person in George Herbert Walker Bush. It makes sense for a person of this stature to run for president, which he did, and he won. In the 1988 election, he ran on the platform that the American children should have to say the Pledge of Allegiance when they come to school in the morning. Michael Dukakis, the Democrat, was against mandatory Pledge of Allegiance, which is to say schools can say the Pledge of Allegiance over the loudspeaker, but it would be up to the student to decide whether they want to stand and whether they want to recite. It's a free speech issue. It was a hot button issue in 1988. Remember, we're still talking about Cold War America here. So Bush was for mandatory saying of the pledge. He was for capital punishment, for gun rights, against abortion, for school prayer. He made the pledge, which would come back to bite him, and we'll talk about this, of no new taxes. He said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And circumstances forced him to recant on that when he took office, which became problematic. He also sought to distance himself from his predecessor and his boss, former boss, Ronald Reagan. As we learned, Reagan was assertive in demonstrating American power around the world, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and even vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And Bush sought to, maintain America's strength in the world, but to do so in a more kind and gentle way, in a way sort of repudiating some of the more sharp, aggressive sides of Ronald Reagan. Again, Dukakis was against the mandatory Pledge of Allegiance. He wanted the American penal system to focus on reforming sentencing. He was against capital punishment. He was against long sentencing because of the war on drugs and the war on crime. We began to see in the 1980s this trend where people were being put behind bars for life. Sometimes for offenses, for non-murder offenses, right? So, and young people, 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds are being sentenced to life without parole. And Dukakis wanted reform of laws like that. Dukakis himself wasn't entirely clear about his position vis-a-vis taxes. One of the big divides in 1980s and 90s politics is, tax rates, right? There was this fear that the Democrats would be, quote unquote, tax and spend liberals in the, sort of LBJ, New Deal, New Frontier, Great Society kind of way. And Bush stuck with Ronald Reagan and sort of his commitment to reducing taxes and to not raising taxes. Dukakis didn't have a clear platform about taxes. It made it hard to vote for him, frankly, because he seemed to evade the issue of taxes because it would be political poison for him to say, "I'm going to raise taxes." My political idol was FDR, and I believe that the government has a responsibility to, you know, um, make sure that no children grow up in poverty. And so for that reason, I'm going to launch programs that are going to protect the most vulnerable members of society. And it's going to cost us. Right? He couldn't say that. It would have made him a clear loser. And instead, he lost by not saying much at all. And you take whatever lesson you want from that. And lastly, he sought to, vis-a-vis foreign policy, uh, he promised that America would not be the first to launch a nuclear attack. That in and of itself is kind of a repudiation of Reagan's uh, perceived, at least, aggressiveness. The 1988 election was a really dirty campaign. George H.W. Bush was able to paint Dukakis as an elite Massachusetts liberal because he was the governor of Massachusetts, and saying that he had quote unquote boutique ideas that only like people who go to Harvard might have. And of course, if you're reading between the lines here, that's sort of a genius move, right? Because George H.W. Bush was quite the blue blood. His father was very wealthy. He went to Yale. He was in Skull and Bones. But, he sort of put on that Texas thing and he said, the American people don't identify with these, arugula eating liberals, with Ivy League backgrounds. And that's, dirty politics, right? There's a sort of hypocrisy to that. More dirty is that Lee Atwater, the Republican strategist who really defined Republican strategy for a couple of decades, claimed that Kitty Dukakis, Michael Dukakis' wife, was a flag burner during the Vietnam War and that she was treated for mental illness. And this goes back to the 1972 campaign where Republicans were, using the claims about the mental illness of candidates or candidates' family members against them. And it worked in 72. And to some degree, it worked here. Usually you don't go after a candidate's wife or husband. That's I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to say that Lee Atwater started that fire. There's plenty of dirty politics on both sides, but I just use that to illustrate how dirty things got from the Bush platform. And sort of the problematic of that is that this isn't really who George H.W. Bush is. He really isn't a dirty politician. He does have a strong moral center, and there were charges that his campaign got away from him by going after Kitty Dukakis, and there were charges that if he can't manage his own campaign, how could he control the party from the post of the presidency? How could he lead the country if he can't lead his own party? Some of the Bush TV campaigns were absolutely ruthless, that one of which sort of goes down in the annals of infamy. It was an ad. So in Massachusetts, as part of these sentencing reform programs, prisoners who had committed, in some cases, violent crimes, where they would get weekend passes, just like, and they'd be supervised to some degree, but they would get out for, a weekend, get out of prison for a weekend, see their family. There was a lot of studies that showed that if you do that, prisoners would come back to prison, like, with more humanity, with maybe less, intentions on, you know, committing acts of violence. Like being with your family, being out of prison can be good. It could be good for you. Well, there was this one guy, Willie Horton, African American fella, and the Bush campaign ran an ad saying, so Willie Horton got out on a sorry, I should say Willie Horton got out on one of these weekend passes and he went on a killing spree. Killed women and children. It was nasty. It was disgusting. And Bush, in campaigning against Dukakis, showed Willie Horton's face for 30 seconds. It's like it was like Willie Horton's mugshot. Yeah. Willie Horton, the murderer. And it's like, if you basically, the ad read like, if you vote for Michael Dukakis, this black man is going to be coming for your women and children. This is the type of person that Michael Dukakis is. He doesn't care about women and children. He lets them out of prison for the weekend and they go on killing sprees. And there was such a tragic affair, that to use something like that against Dukakis, I mean, look, it's fair game. Like, if you're the governor of Massachusetts and that happens on your watch, you do have to answer for it. But according to many at the time, and perhaps most since, it was a little over the top in terms of its dirtiness. Dukakis, for his part, went against Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle was the vice presidential candidate who ran alongside Bush 41, and he said that basically was calling Quayle an idiot. And during his vice presidency, Quayle stumbled over himself enough times to substantiate Dukakis's assessment of him. Dukakis fired his campaign assistant, Donna Brazil, who spread rumors that Bush had an affair with his assistant. So there was some dirty campaigning in the Dukakis camp as well. False claims of Bush having an affair. To his credit, Dukakis fired Donna Brazil. Donna Brazil, by the way, who's still very active in Democratic politics. This did not derail her career at all. Or if it did, it derailed it temporarily. Donna Brazil is still on TV as a talking head for Democratic causes. Anyway, there was dirtiness on both sides, and it's not the first dirty campaign in American history, right? But it was particularly dirty, and it wasn't particularly close. The former vice president won with 79% in the Electoral College. He won with an 8-point margin in the popular vote. He won across the country. Very successful campaign. Dirty, successful. Was it successful because it was dirty? Lee Atwater would probably say yes. It could just be that George H.W. Bush was an eminently qualified candidate who deserved to be president. Let's get into his domestic policies, but before we do, we have to note that the Democrats controlled both houses for 4 years. And so the Republican president had to deal with that opposition, and he did have the temperament to deal with opposition. He had been in Congress and he had enough experience in politics to know how to deal with the opposing side. But the Democrats in the House wanted to rebuild some of the social programs that the Reagan administration had crushed. And the Democrats convinced him through reason that it was necessary and proper for him to raise taxes. But he campaigned by saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And partially to placate the Democrats and reach across the aisle, partially because he knew it was economically necessary to raise taxes, he raised taxes. And this, he says, was his biggest regret. Not only did he defy his campaign promise, but it cost him the 92 election, as we'll see. Okay. So walk you through some of his major domestic policy proposals and acts. Again, remembering that the thrust of this lecture will be on foreign policy. Bush 41 passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protects disabled people under the parameters of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The ADA demands, quote, reasonable accommodations for employees and accessibility in public spaces. So I should say I was 15 years old when George H.W. Bush took office. He was president throughout most of my high school career. Um, is that true? No, no, for half of my high school career, of course. Um, and yeah, just, I'm bugging out of my own biography here. I'm so tempted to tell you all of these stories about my relationship with the first Bush presidency when I was about your age, but I promised you I was going to try to keep this lecture comparatively brief. But I do remember that, um, at my school they built ramps so that people in wheelchairs could get to the bleachers in on the football field. And at the mall, they were building ramps, like everywhere around the country. They were building ramps so that people with wheelchairs could get around. I remember all of the we have this elevated train system in the city of Chicago, and they were putting in all of these elevators because people with disabilities couldn't get on. They were putting these ramps that they would pull off on Chicago buses so that people who needed accessibility to public transportation had it. And this is because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. My father's brother, Richard, who passed away a couple of years ago, lived to be 79. He had cerebral palsy, never could walk or talk. He was always in a walker. And so this really opened up the world for him. So this is, building on the civil rights agenda and including people with disabilities into the framework for civil rights. Uh, to the contrary, Bush vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1991. It was kind of a vexed bill. The language of it wasn't entirely clear, and it might have been by design that the Democrats in Congress passed a bill with less than perfectly clear language. The bill may or may not have encouraged companies to establish racial quotas. The legal team, the legal counsel of Bush 41 thought that the Civil Rights Act of 91 did indeed encourage companies, though not demand companies to establish racial quotas. Democrats in Congress uh, said that quotas were not encouraged, let alone demanded. Um, I don't think that George Herbert Walker Bush wanted to veto the Civil Rights Act of 91. What he wanted was for the Democrats to be more clear about racial quotas. There is some discussion and debate as to why the bill wasn't rewritten in a way that would have allowed Bush to have signed it in good conscience. It's not easy to veto a civil rights bill, right? And I really don't think that George H.W. Bush had any racial animus to speak of. I've never read anything that suggested that he was a racist for his time or for all time. It was a rough political battle. His veto almost got overridden, but it wasn't. So his veto stood by a vote, and the Civil Rights Act of 1991 does not exist. In this realm of identity politics, Bush passed the Immigration Act of 1990. He was able to pass it by speaking to Republicans who spoke to the virtues of family values. And part of the impetus behind the Immigration Act of 1990 was to reunify families. So if you had children who were born in the US and thus were American citizens, and their parent or parents had to move back to, for example, Mexico, The Immigration Act of 1990 would bring parents back so that they could be with their children. Yeah. Um, it could go the other way also, right? There could be, parents who, had the kids in, say, El Salvador or Mexico or Nigeria, it doesn't matter. And then they came to the US, they became citizens, and the Immigration Act of 1990 would bring their children into the United States from Nigeria or El Salvador or Mexico. The Immigration Act of 1990 raised the cap on immigration from 270,000 per year to 675,000 people annually. So that's a threefold increase uh, in the immigration cap. So that's positive. And it eliminated the exclusion of gay people from coming to the United States. Prior to this, openly gay people could be excluded from coming to the United States, although that wasn't always the case that they were. So, all in all, the Immigration Act of 1990 is a positive thing. It's reasonable, and it was signed by a Republican president with the support of the Democratic Congress. Bush 41 also signed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which was a response to this major oil spill in 1990, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Totally destroyed the Gulf of Mexico. But it's, worse oil spills have happened since. Because accidents happen, but also because some presidents refuse to regulate the oil industry. Look, accidents are going to happen either way, but accidents happen more, and the accidents that happen tend to be bigger when we fail to regulate this economic sector in particular. Bush got a certain degree of praise for a proposal that he had that didn't go too far, but the spirit of it is kind of beautiful, called the 1,000 Points of Light. It was sort of designed to get Americans to volunteer more, right? To join non-governmental organizations, to help others in need, and basically building on the Reagan argument that you can't count on the government to take care of your communities for you. You should go out and support your communities with your heart and with your feet. Yeah. He appointed 2 justices, Souter and Thomas. Thomas is still on the court, never speaking in oral argument. There was a pretty nasty confirmation hearing. Clarence Thomas got a bit of the Kavanaugh treatment. Thomas was accused, quite credibly, of sexual harassment. It got ugly in the Senate, but Clarence Thomas remains a Supreme Court justice. He funded the International Space Station. I could probably put that in domestic policies, but I don't know. But it's not there. And he pardoned 6 more Iran-Contra criminals, building on Gerald Ford's legacy of pardoning people in who got caught up in scandals, right? Watergate. And we had this discussion about when it's necessary and proper, or at least when it's appropriate to pardon people who commit high crimes against the country. And you can come to your own conclusions about this issue of pardoning, this issue of forgiveness. And forgiveness and pardoning, aren't necessarily 2 peas in the same pod, right? We can forgive people with our hearts who have committed disgusting crimes, but still hold them legally accountable for their actions. The way H.W. Bush painted it, is that he had a lot of forgiveness in his heart. And so he wanted to show forgiveness with the power vested in him as the President of the United States. Judge as you wish. So I don't have that much to say about Bush's domestic policies. As we've already discussed, Bush was really open about his preference for foreign policy, and his record speaks to that. So let's dive into foreign policies. First, we'll talk about NAFTA, then Panama, the Soviet Union's collapse, and then Iraq, his most lasting legacy. Here we have a political cartoon with 4 presidents in a row saying, I've ordered targeted airstrikes on Iraq. This is going to be a long-term project, humanitarian, and both Bushes, Clinton, and Obama, 4 presidents, have invaded Iraq in their own way. The 2 Republican presidents, both Bushes, father and son, went full bore into Iraq. The 2 Democratic presidents have been maintained their allegiance to targeted airstrikes. We should note that this is not the most flattering picture of George W. Bush. They make him look like quite the dunce, to which I will say nothing further. We'll start with what we sometimes call intermestic policy. This is a political science term that we don't use too much in history, but it's intermestic is a portmanteau of domestic and international policy. So NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is a policy that has both international and domestic components to it. NAFTA ended most of the tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So it promoted a free trade zone between the US, Canada, and Mexico, the 3 main economies on the continent. It also sought to ensure copyright protections so that American drugs and American technologies wouldn't be reproduced in Mexico without copyright purchasing. NAFTA reduced investment restrictions, allowing for Mexicans to invest in the American economy, Americans to invest in the Canadian economy with more freedom. Again, just trying to bring Mexico, Canada, and the United States together as a trading bloc. And when we trade together, we're more likely to engage in cultural exchanges and ideas. And it's all together a good thing. Trade, generally speaking, is good. Unrestricted trade, has its limitations. And of course, the devil is in the details when it comes to trade restrictions. Democrats were against NAFTA because they were convinced that American jobs would go to Mexico, right? Good union jobs. And the unions were, tended to support the Democrats, and Democrats, in trying to support the unions that supported them, were against NAFTA. My dad worked for Kellogg's for 38 years, and when NAFTA was passed, Kellogg's basically shut down its Battle Creek, Michigan plant so that cereal could be produced in Mexico. Why would you pay union workers in Michigan, a living wage, a healthy wage, when you could just go, mechanize the production of cereals and pay employees, a quarter or a fifth the amount, maybe even less, maybe 5 or 10% as much as you pay an American worker. And so the Democrats opposed that. They also opposed it because, in Mexico at the time, and frankly, in most of Mexico now, in like the maquiladoras in the northern Mexico and in the industrial belt of Mexico, there's not a lot of workers' rights. There's a lot of oppression and exploitation, and Democrats opposed even Mexican firms exploiting their workers. Democrats opposed, Mexican politicians who would invite American firms in, tax them a bit and let them exploit the Mexican working class. So the Democrats were against it. George Bush 41 negotiated it, and he wasn't able to sign it in time. But in his first year in office, Bill Clinton, the Democrat, signed it against some of the will of his party members. And then last year, this NAFTA agreement was summarily dismissed by Donald Trump. And in place of it, we have the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA, which seeks to place some restrictions in an effort to um, protect American industry. It's not that much different than NAFTA, although I should say if you were to ask me 3 questions comparing NAFTA to the USMCA, I would do okay, after which, like, the 4th question, I probably, would just stumble and bumble, and you'd realize I know very little about the 2. Um, Here's 3 political cartoons giving some insight into NAFTA. Not my insight, but on the left, we have a U.S. factory. Labor Day, this year's picnic will be held in Mexico, where your job went. And then this worker with his lunch pail being like, "Bored." And then in the middle, we have, is it free trade? Is NAFTA free trade, or is it a trap? Right? And this political cartoon from 2001 compares, tries to say that NAFTA is sort of like a Pearl Harbor, and George H.W. Bush this is sort of a play on the movie Dr. Strangelove, where Peter Sellers is riding the airplane, crazy guy, as Dr. Strangelove, and basically that, like, NAFTA and the WTO and other um, um, trade agreements were selling out the American worker. Yeah. And that the Republicans and the Democrats alike, Bob Dole, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, George Bush, and Bill Clinton, they're all just trying to sell out the American worker, supporting American corporations, and bombing the American dream. Yeah. On the right are 2 cartoons about from 2020. The first is NAFTA negotiations, and there's Donald Trump with his American baseball bat, American flag baseball bat, like, I'll start the negotiations here, and he's gonna smash this beehive, and Mexico and Canada are just sitting under knowing they're going to get stung. And then the bottom cartoon, I couldn't resist. Mexico and Canada are looking at Donald Trump's negotiating position. Trump really had at Canada and Mexico. He was really antagonized NAFTA, antagonized his neighbors to the north and south. And as is the case, there was a kernel of truth to his argument. It is indeed the case that NAFTA hurt the American worker. And we'll see what his replacement for NAFTA does for the American worker. Time will tell. Maybe this USMCA will be a positive legacy of the Trump administration. Yeah. No, I'm not so good at telling the future. So if that's an intermestic policy, let's get to foreign policy. We'll start with Panama, since we're already talking about hemispheric relations. We'll stay in the Western Hemisphere. That is George H.W. Bush. Nice. George H.W. Bush chilling out with Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega, later on the right, there is his mugshot in Miami when he got arrested. See how that happened. Panama is right between Costa Rica and Colombia, and it became a bit of a trouble spot, leading to an invasion. Let me tell you the story. The Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega was a U.S. ally in the 1970s. Noriega worked with George H.W. Bush when Bush was the head of the CIA. Worked with the CIA in the 1980s against El Salvador. Remember, the U.S. invaded El Salvador when Reagan was president and Bush was vice president. Noriega worked with the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the CIA protected Noriega from the DEA, despite the fact that Noriega was the biggest drug dealer in history. In the wake of the Iran-Contra scandal, Noriega was exposed, and it was shown how awful Noriega was. He was more than a strongman. He was a dictator with fascistic tendencies. Reagan demanded that Noriega step down. Reagan issued sanctions and froze the assets of Manuel Noriega, but he didn't invade, in part because he was active in El Salvador and things went cattywampus in Lebanon and everything got nasty with Iran and Iraq. And then there was the Iran-Contra scandal. So he didn't invade because he had such a robust foreign policy. The American military was stretched pretty thin in the 1980s, to put it lightly. But he also didn't invade, Reagan didn't invade, because his vice president, George H.W. Bush, was tied to Noriega in the 70s, right? You can't show this picture of these two guys just hanging out and smiling and then go say this guy's a bastard and we got to take him down. Yeah. In 1988, during Reagan's last year, Noriega lost elections. They were messed up elections, but Noriega lost them. He refused to step down. He survived a military coup. And in October of 89, 4 American military personnel were seized by Noriega's forces. Now, look, you could ask what U.S. military personnel were doing in Panama, but we know, right? And so we have another hostage crisis. And so in Operation Just Cause, over the Christmas holidays from December 90 to January 91, the American military fought in Panama for 4 reasons, right? To make sure that American citizens were safe in Panama, to protect the Panama Canal because they were afraid that Noriega would try to seek revenge on the United States by blocking the Panama Canal, thus blocking a substantial portion of American trade and everybody else's trade, right? So safeguarding U.S. citizens, protecting the Panama Canal, combating drug trafficking and drug money laundering, and Noriega was perhaps one of the greatest drug money launderers of all time. And lastly, to the extent to which we have foreign policies based on human rights, Bush had a good argument for getting Noriega out of Panama because he was a nasty, nasty leader. In this 5-week invasion, 23 Americans and 1,000 Panamanians died. Noriega was captured. He was tried in the U.S. He was convicted on drug trafficking counts, right? So they just went for the low-hanging fruit. Drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. They could have, if they really wanted to, they could have gotten him for, murder, right? But he got 40 years. He was released, and then he got sent to France, where he faced similar charges, and then he got sick and sent back to Panama, where he died under house arrest. A couple years ago, maybe 5 years ago, Noriega died. You can look it up. I think it wasn't that long ago. So that's the Panama story. It was, reasonably successful, right? You say, we're going to make it short and sweet, and we're going to get this guy. He's a bad guy, and he was a bad guy. And did the U.S. create that bad guy? On some level, yes. But listen, before I get to Russia, I should say, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. To some degree, you have to give foreign policy strategists some leeway, and you can decide the degree to which you're willing to do so. Noriega was an American ally in the wake of Nicaragua. The U.S. built up Noriega. Should they have? In retrospect, probably not. Did they know at the time that he was going to become a strong man, a dictator, a ruthless SOB? I mean, you could argue that the writing was on the wall, but that's 2020 hindsight. So they built this guy up. He becomes ruthless. He's destroying the lives of his citizens. There's an argument to be made that if you break it, you buy it. If you put the Christmas tree up, you take that Christmas tree down. And Noriega was our Christmas tree. Same thing with Saddam Hussein. The United States put Saddam Hussein up in the war against Iran in the 1980s. It's not wrong necessarily for the United States to then invade Iraq and take down Saddam Hussein, who would likely not have been in power and surely would have not had the degree of power that he had were it not for the United States. So, I mean, these are foreign policy adages that you can agree or disagree with, but they're common. If you break it, you buy it. The US broke Panama. They were invested, they had to buy it. The US put up the Christmas tree, the US got to take it down. He was our guy. Time to get rid of him. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the wisest foreign policy. I'm not going to stake a claim in this, right? That's obviously a troubled, it could be a recipe for death and disaster. But that's just a reflection on the Panama situation. Generally speaking, the Panama invasion was seen as successful. It accomplished what it sought to accomplish, and it didn't go on for 20 years. It was 5 weeks. Also successful was H.W. Bush's policy with regard to the Soviet Union. As we know, in November of '89, the Berlin Wall fell. Over the course of the ensuing 2 years, there was catastrophic power vacuums that emerged throughout Central and Eastern Europe. We in the West talk about the fall of the Soviet Union as a great victory, and it was, but the people, the human beings, the children who watched it all collapse, who had to suffer through its collapse, those are like that's a real instability. These were real problems. These were real people who didn't have access to food. They didn't have access to water, and they didn't have a sense of security, and they didn't know what the new borders were going to be. And it was, and East Germans who didn't know how they were going to be incorporated into this thing called United Germany, because a lot of them had never been Germans, right? There was no a lot of people didn't, there was no United Germany. So in retrospect, it is quite remarkable how not chaotic the fall of the Soviet Union was. It could have been much, much worse. And to some degree, the United States can enjoy the credit for watching over peaceful, orderly transition of powers from autocratic to more democratic regimes, from communist to more capitalist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe. And George H.W. Bush deserves a lot of credit for this. And Gorbachev deserves just as much, if not more. So Bush met with Gorbachev in December of '89 in Malta. They didn't know where to meet, right? Ordinarily they meet in Berlin, but which side of Berlin would they meet on? It was just so complicated. Bush met Gorbachev in Malta in '89. They got the dialogue going a month after the fall of the wall. 2 years later, they both signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or the START 1 treaty. There's been a START 2 treaty to sort of reduce military production, particularly nuclear production, for the post-Cold War world. On his watch, the Soviet Union collapsed on Christmas of 1991. A lesser president probably would have sought that moment to tap dance on the grave of communism. And when Bush died a year or two ago, which was during the Trump presidency, which of course changed the tenor of American politics, to say nothing of our changed relationship with Russia. But Bush was remembered fondly in his obituaries for not rubbing the American victory in the Cold War in the faces of former communist countries. He held out olive branches and he showed empathy. And honestly, I could see a world where if Bush did one victory lap after another in 1991 and 1992 when the Soviet Union dissolved, he could have been reelected in 92. But he knew that, humiliation is like so powerful. He could have humiliated them. He could have rubbed lemon in the eye and threw eggs at the faces of all of those former Eastern Bloc countries, all of the stans, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and tried to show them how wrong they were. But he didn't. He didn't tap dance on the graves of the former Soviet republics or the former Soviet satellite states. Now listen. Anyone who mourns the loss of the Soviet Union is a fool. Anyone who mourns the end of Eastern European communism is a total fool. But anyone who celebrates the destruction of communism in 91 is heartless. These are real people's lives. And very much to his credit, Bush 41 handled it like a real diplomat, like a real pro. That's what we elected him for, to be a real experienced political leader. And bless him. Bless that guy. But this is a huge turning point in the history of the United States, right? The Soviet Union has collapsed. The Cold War is over. There's only one superpower remaining, and it became the purview of the United States to make sure that America maintained its place that it had earned as the only remaining superpower. And the codification of this is in the Defense Planning and Guidance Initiative, sometimes known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It was later revised by Dick Cheney and Colin Powell to become the Bush Doctrine, the Bush 43 Doctrine. The Defense Planning and Guidance Initiative lays out a blueprint to ensure that no country will ever rise to challenge America's hegemony, that America will use unilateral force instead of multilateral force to stop other countries from challenging American dominance around the world, that America will engage in preemptive action. We'll go attack countries before they attack us to make sure that other countries don't challenge our dominance. Yeah. That America will have a forward presence. They called it the base force approach. Have military bases all over the world to ensure that no country will ever seek to uproot America as the dominant power. And I would urge you to look into the Defense Planning and Guidance Initiative, the DPGI. This is a super instructive and important document in contemporary American foreign policy history. I have so much to say about the DPG, but I'm not going to. I just would like to note, as we begin to move on, that this was a huge success. And like I said, H.W. Bush could have really politicized this, and to his detriment, but to his political detriment, he didn't. But to his credit, he did not politicize this in the ugly ways that lesser people would have. He instead staked his legacy on the showdown with Iraq. Can Bush make Saddam blink? Time magazine asks. Back to Iraq. We talked about it in the Reagan administration. The U.S. put up Saddam Hussein as a bulwark against Ayatollah Khomeini in the 8-year Iran-Iraq War. And we'll talk about Iraq again under the Clinton administration and the second Bush administration. Iraqi policy is central to understanding post-Cold War American foreign policy. This is Iraq on the right. I use this map to show how little access Iraq, it's a fairly decent sized country, how little access to water Iraq has. And as you know, I'm not a geographer, but I'm pretty sure that water is really important, and it's particularly important if you're in the desert, which much of Iraq is. And Iraq wanted more water, which is the precipitating cause for the problem that we're about to see. It's also another precipitating cause, as this image on the right, and this is 15 months after the massacre in Dujail, for which Saddam Hussein was hanged by America in 2006. I mean, hanged by the Iraqi National Guard, but the Iraqi National Guard is bought and paid for by the United States in 2006. This is Don Rumsfeld, Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East, and he's shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and he's smiling, and Hussein is pledging his support to the United States in the U.S. war against Iran. So remember, this is our ally, Saddam Hussein, and this is another dude that we built up that we had to take down. The Sykes-Picot arrangement that the British drew up, the British and the French drew up, created an Iraq that was virtually landlocked, and we all need water. The Iran-Iraq war destabilized the region. The civil war in Lebanon that we talked about destabilized the region. The 1987 Palestinian Intifada, destabilized the region. The Reagan administration was worried about a whole Middle Eastern blow up. And Saddam Hussein threatened to make that happen. And we can't have that, because this same generation of foreign policy leaders, they saw what happened when the oil supply becomes unstable. They saw, as we talked about, the 1974 OPEC crisis. And for the world's economy to run, we need oil. And Iraq has a lot of oil. And Iraq has a lot of control over supply lines of oil. And Iraq was nasty to Iran, and arguably genocidal towards its Kurdish citizens and its Shia citizens. There was arguably, there was an attempt at ethnic cleansing of the Kurds, and arguably an attempt at ethnic cleansing of the Shia communities of Iraq, which is about 30 to 40% of the Iraqi population. So remember, the U.S. was funding both sides of the Iran-Iraq war. Iraq lost a lot of friends and a lot of face in the Iran-Iraq war. And the U.S. and the U.K. in the middle of that war pledged to each other that they would defend against an Iraq that was becoming increasingly aggressive in the neighborhood, not just against Iran, but against its eastern neighbor, Kuwait. 2 years after the Iran-Iraq war ended, using the weapons that the United States gave Saddam Hussein, in August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. In doing that, it threatened the stability of the Saudi regime, our dear allies in the region. Say what you will about it. Iraq used chemical and biological weapons on the Kurdish populations, chemical weapons that they got, some of which they got from the United States. Iraq was developing a nuclear program, and Iraq just had this, like, Saddam Hussein is a brute. He was our brute, then he became the neighborhood bully. And so when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the U.S. had to act. Saddam Hussein offered to cease hostilities in exchange for half of Kuwait. Give us half of Kuwait, access to a bunch of water. I'll stop attacking Kuwait, Hussein said. Bush refused. Hussein offered to cease hostilities if Israel pulled out of the occupied territories. But being loyal to America's Israeli allies, Bush refused. The United Nations condemned Iraq. They imposed sanctions, and they endorsed force in Resolution 678. The US earned the support of France and Britain and the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and 40 other countries. This was a truly multilateral action. The Saudis paid for half of the $60 billion war costs. Germany and Japan funded another 25%. So the US only had to pay for about 20% of the war. But US troops were about 73% of the coalition forces. So it was American people, American men and women fighting, American people fighting. But much of the world was committed to stopping Saddam Hussein. And, generally speaking, this is a good thing, right? To have multilateral efforts. Do you need to have allies to go to war? No. George W. Bush went into Iraq with much less international support. He had allies. Tony Blair, infamously in most British circles, sent British people off to die in war in Iraq. So you don't need allies, but it's better if you have them. Sorry if that's an opinion. Maybe that's not an opinion. I think that's a fact. I think it's better to have allies than not. Is it necessary to have allies? No, I guess not. So Operation Desert Storm began in the winter of 91. U.S.-led air forces attacked. There were 4 days of ground forces. And Bush allowed the regime to stay. He let Saddam Hussein live. He let Saddam Hussein rule. And when asked, he said that otherwise, quote, we would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and in effect rule Iraq, which he left to his son to do 10 years later. Should the United States have deposed Saddam Hussein? I don't know. I don't know. And I'm tempted to walk you through the pro con of deposing the brutish leader of a foreign country. But I urge you to really think about whether it would have been appropriate to, take Hussein out of power, whether that means killing him or it means just removing him from power and trying him for crimes against humanity and imprisoning him. But he allowed Hussein and his henchmen to stay. In this war, about 300 soldiers died, half of whom were Americans, and 40,000 Iraqis died. It was, I remember it. I was 14, 15 years old. I remember watching the bombs being lobbed. I remember the Scud missiles shooting through the air on CNN with, patriotic songs being played in the background. And this was the cure to the Vietnam War syndrome. No longer was America afraid to send its military overseas. No longer were we afraid of getting bogged down in a long war. We could go in there. We can stop the invasion of Kuwait, and we don't have to worry about getting stuck in a long, drawn-out war. So now Americans can feel free to send their troops overseas to stop bad guys around the world. Fast forward 10 years and America gets bogged down in 2 wars, right? So we cured the Vietnam War syndrome. We're no longer afraid to send our troops overseas, but then we send our troops overseas to Afghanistan, which America seeks to get out. Biden just recently announced that he's going to pull troops out of Afghanistan once and for all on September 11th, 2021. 20 years, 20-year war. And America was wrapped up in the Iraq War for most of that time. So while it cured Vietnam syndrome, it created another set of syndromes for American foreign policymakers. And lastly, on foreign policy, just a few very noteworthy passages in the foreign policy record of Bush 41. You have the Tiananmen Square massacre, or the Tiananmen Square riots, you would call them if you were a Chinese communist. The Chinese government sent in tanks to crush a pro-democracy movement in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Bush responded cautiously. Remember, the Cold War was, the wall was still up, right? The U.S. isn't about to launch a ground war in China. Light sanctions. Some people in Congress thought that the United States should have pushed harsher sanctions. It depends on your feelings about sanctions, should you have feelings about such matters. In February of 90, you have the 2+4 approach, trying to bring East and West Germany together, bringing the two sides into one united country that I live in. So just sort of bringing Germany into NATO, getting the Soviet troops out, just trying to get the four victors of World War II, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, working with the two Germanys. So the six powers got together, and how are we going to figure this one out? Maggie Thatcher, by the way, was suspected but wasn't revealed for certain until after her death. Maggie Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, was doing everything she could to stop Germany from uniting, because she feared that a united Germany would just totally upset the balance of power in Europe and upset British influence in Central and Western Europe, which was right, which was true. Germany has become the European powerhouse, and Britain is not. Britain isn't even part of Europe anymore, so there. Clearly, I have more to say about that, but I won't. In September of 1990, Bush declared the need for a new world order based in multilateralism, which is to say working with our allies and partners around the world, and democracy. This new world order wasn't quite defined, but it became more defined when his son took power, and Wolfowitz and Cheney and Powell took office, and Don Rumsfeld took office, and the Defense Planning and Guidance Strategy became the New World Order, which is, again, America doing everything it can to make sure that nobody will ever challenge or rival her power. Bush supported Israel in the Intifada. His administration shared intelligence and weapons with Israel in their war against the the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He also gave Israel $10 billion to help to settle Soviet Jews who had suffered terribly, mightily under communist rule. I remember growing up as an American Jew, going to temple, and year after year we would do fundraisers to bring Jewish people out of the communist bloc into Israel so that they could live in peace for once. And all of that gets complicated, but such is the neighborhood. And in December of 92, as a lame duck, he had already lost the election of 92. Through UN Resolution 794, Bush committed U.S. troops to Somalia to help to solve a humanitarian crisis that broke down, sort of broke through in Somalia. Somalia became a total dystopia, and Later, Clinton took office and totally mismanaged the Somalia affair, leading to the Black Hawk Down affair, which we will talk about when Bill Clinton takes office, which he did in 1992. Bush in 1988 said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then in 1992, when he ran again, he said, "Look at my resume. Look at the success that I've offered the American people." And they read his resume, and he was dismayed at what they had to say. And here's what they had to say. They had to say, "Bill Clinton, congratulations. You are the 42nd president of the United States with 69% of the Electoral College vote." He won 43% of the popular vote. We had the first of two campaigns by H. Ross Perot, the gazillionaire third party independent candidate. Perot won 19% of the popular vote and a grand total of 0 electoral college votes. Say what you will about the American electoral college system, but there's surely some disproportionality there. And so the people spoke on George H.W. Bush, or did they? You could look at this data and say, well, it's pretty clear the Bush presidency was a failure. But that's not necessarily true, right? Generally speaking, the American people like to throw the bums out to bring some new bums into power after 8 or 12 years, right? There had been 12 years of Republicans in the White House, and Americans sometimes just want change. They want a fresh face. And as you will see, Bill Clinton was a young, fresh face. And it was the 90s. America was starting to look to the 21st century. America wanted perhaps to feel young again. And maybe they weren't really voting in 1992 on the Bush 41 record, or his resume. Perhaps they weren't voting against Bush at all, but they were voting for Clinton. Younger, brighter-eyed. And I want to conclude by just offering this thought I have about the legacy of George H.W. Bush. Because this is very recent history. This is very much my lifetime. And when he died a couple of years ago, a couple of years into the Trump administration, he really got a really sweet and kind send-off from both sides of the aisle. A lot of his perhaps more dark chapters, like the Willie Horton ad, they were remembered in the obituaries written about him. Yeah. But in light of Donald Trump's temperament, which, you can say what you will about it, George H.W. Bush was looked upon in retrospect by most Democrats and many Republicans as being a moderate, kind, compassionate president who was measured, who had empathy, who, like the rest of us, is perfectly imperfect, but who had a strong moral core, and he sought to speak to all Americans. There was this political cartoon that I recall from his the week of his passing, where there was this image of Donald Trump sort of bloated as though he were like a helium balloon, and he's lifting George Herbert Walker Bush into heaven, right? So his legacy improves in the wake of the 45th president of the United States. I would urge you to think seriously about who George H.W. Bush is and what he accomplished. His legacy is not his, right? His legacy is wrapped up in what his son did. His legacy is wrapped up in what um, you ensuing Republican presidents did in their time. But it's worth giving some serious thought to the person and the president, George H.W. Bush. And I hope that this talk today gave you some evidence to help you to think about him. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope that you learned. I hope that you were focused. I hope that you got a lot of takeaways. And I hope to see you soon. Until then, please take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. Bye bye.